Welcome back to part 3 of drawing a chocolate Labrador on Fabriano Artistico watercolor paper. I'm using the basic 12 pencil set from both Polychromos and Prismacolor. And let's see, I'm also using a blending stump and a monopoint plastic eraser. I believe those are all of the supplies that I've been using so far. So right now I'm just using the Polychromos ultramarine light, cooling off some of those orangey tones. Red or orange and blue are complementary colors, so that will cool down those warm tones. Can't quite tell yet if this is a, it's a Polychromos. So I'm using the walnut brown Polychromos, just darkening up this area a little bit, adding some value in there. Not too worried about doing a fur texture just yet, just working on building up the color. Using my blending stump now to mix all that color together, just using pressure to kind of burnish the colors. Sorry if you hear some extra heavy breathing in here. My dog is snuggled on my lap right now and demanding cuddles, so of course I must comply and keep snorting. So using the black Polychromos, adding in some little fur texture and some darker value in that little fold there on the neck. Just working on some of those little details in the fur. Now the Polychromos pencils are harder than the Prismacolors, so it's easier to get detail work with them. You can sharpen them to a finer point and really get those fine lines in there. Really press hard to get the colors in. So they're great for finishing areas where the Prismacolors are nice and soft and waxy, and are great for laying down colors in the beginning and blending and mixing. Right now I'm using the walnut brown from the Polychromos and starting to put in some fur texture, some little lines denoting the direction of the fur and the texture. My dog's starting to snore. And just slowly building up that fur texture. You want to make sure that your pencil strokes are random. Really look at your reference photo and see what the fur is doing. Make sure your strokes are going in the correct direction that the fur is going in, and that they're not too regimented. They're not all exactly the same. You want some randomness in there. Back in with the light ultramarine, the Polychromos. That section that I'm working on right there is just a little bit lighter and cooler in value. So I'm going in and lightening things up with this pencil. Remember, there are a lot of different colors in the fur that all go together to make up the overall color. So you really want to look for all the different colors that you can see from your reference photo. There are lots of warms and cools in this section, and so I'm adding the cooler tones in with this ultramarine blue or light ultramarine Polychromos. Now I'm using the Prismacolor, I believe it's the dark brown. I'm just adding in some value as the fur is starting to transition over to a darker area. So much of this is all about the contrast. You want to make sure that your lights are light enough, your darks are dark enough. That's always, value is always going to be the most important thing. Value is how light or dark something is. And that's going to be the biggest part of making something look realistic. Your values and your edges. Going back in with the black Polychromos. Adding in some texture here. Now I'm using some of the Polychromos Magenta to add in some really warm tones. back in with the black Polychromos. I believe that it is the purple. Or no, maybe it's still the black. Sorry, I don't think there is a purple. Oh, it's the Prismacolor. It's probably the violet blue. Either violet or violet blue, I can't remember. And this is the black Polychromos now. And the sienna brown Prismacolor. Oh my goodness, my dog is so snuggly right now. And snory. Using my blending stump to just kind of smooth out some of those strokes so they're not all quite so precise and harsh. I'm using the black Prismacolor right now, darken up that value. And the dark brown Prismacolor. A little bit more of that violet blue in there from the Prismacolor. Blending it out a little bit more, kind of mushing those colors together to get them to mix nicely. So you layer the colors on top of each other and then burnish them. And here I'm using my blending stump to burnish. You can also burnish with another pencil, another Prismacolor. The Prismacolor works better for burnishing than the Polychromos do because the Prismacolors are softer and waxier, and you need that to burnish those colors together. But I don't want to change the value of the colors that I had just mixed there, and so I use my blending stump instead. Right now I'm using the burnt ochre Polychromos. And now the walnut brown. Just a lot of back and forth with all the different colors, warming things up, cooling them off a little, adding in different colors of fur, lights and darks to create texture. Colored pencil is not a fast medium, that's for sure. Using a little bit of the magenta Polychromos here. And some of the dark brown Prismacolor. And some black Prismacolor. The Prismacolor really helps me like push in that color into the fibers of the paper and build up that value. And because the paper is so hardy, it can take so much, so many layers, and is really great about taking a lot of abuse. It works well with this technique. Some more blending. Really should be using a thicker blending stump. This one's looking a little worse for the wear, but it's working. Now adding in some of the details with the black Polychromos. And notice I turn the pencil like every couple of strokes, I turn it like a quarter turn, just so I can kind of keep that sharp point. You can feel the difference on your paper, on the friction between the pencil and your paper. And you just keep turning the pencil, it goes to like a sharper side each time. A little more of that magenta Polychromos. And some of the walnut brown. I'm going up top now with some of the white Prismacolor and laying down a nice layer of white waxy pencil. And some of the light ultramarine Polychromos. It's really light on the top of the dog's head right here. And so just adding in that light layer to of the light ultramarine and the white. Now I'm starting to warm it up with the, what is it, the burnt sienna, I believe, from the Polychromos. Burnt ochre. I always get that one wrong. And blending those colors together a little bit. And now some of the Polychromos walnut brown. And just adding in some texture, some little hair strokes. Especially as I transition from the shadow side there to where the light's hitting on the top of the head. I want to make sure that transition is nice and soft and gradual, because that helps show that the skull is rounded, the dog's head is rounded and kind of spherical. And if I make that transition too sharp, then it's going to look like there's a corner there. So you want that edge nice and soft. Some more of the light ultramarine, Polychromos. And some of the poly walnut brown. I'm giving it a quick blend to buff out any harsh pencil strokes there. Putting down some more white Prismacolor. We'll work on this next layer. I'm using the Polychromos burnt ochre. Just using a real light touch here. So in this section, I had worked ahead a little bit off camera. So now we're coming in right as I'm working on the area around the eye. I'm using the Polychromos walnut brown here. And now the black Polychromos. Just working on building up both the hair texture and the values in this area. Still working with that black Polychromos, just really working on the texture in this area. I really hope you guys can hear my dog snoring. It's very relaxing. This area requires like a really light touch because of how much light is hitting the top of the head and the shininess of the dog's fur. So there's quite a bit of contrast between the lights and the darks here. And so even though the lab is a chocolate lab, the top of its head is really quite light. And so having to get everything the right value and still get the colors in there as they should be is a little tricky. So I'm just using a really light touch everywhere. Going in with some of the Polychromos Walnut Brown now. And now the Polychromos Light Ultramarine. And some of the white Polychromos. And I'm putting some of the light ultramarine over where I just pulled that white out. I'm going to pull out a little bit more. The white Polychromos works almost like you're scraping off the color that's there. And then you can go back over, if it's too light, you can go back over it with something else like I'm doing here with the light ultramarine. Just to give it a little bit of a tint. Now some of the walnut brown Polychromos. Then switch to the black Polychromos. Needed to go a little bit darker here. I'm using a little bit more of that magenta Polychromos. Areas around the eye and on the ears tend to have more blood vessels, and so they tend to be warmer in color. Same thing around the nose and like the gums of the mouth. I guess gums and jowls. I'm using the black Polychromos right now. I'm just working in some of that texture. Now I'm bringing in some of the black Prismacolor and just putting down a layer of that around where the eye is really dark. You're going to want the most contrast in your drawing there in the eye. That contrast between light and dark draws the viewer's eye, and so you want the viewer to be looking at your subject's eyes in the portrait, and so you, between the pupil and the shadows in the eye and the highlight, that's going to be your area of biggest contrast. And just pushing those darks a little bit more with the Prismacolor black. Going in with the black Polychromos for some more precise control than I get with the black Prismacolor. I don't get as dark of a value because it doesn't go on as thickly, but I have more control and precision with the Polychromos. Some more of that magenta Polychromos. And the light ultramarine Polychromos. And now going back in with that black Polychromos. Putting in some little hairs. Here I'm starting to like map out the shapes in the eye using a very light touch on this black Polychromos. Want to be very careful to maintain that highlight. It's going to be the color of the paper, so I don't want to put anything down on top of where that highlight is. Here I'm using the I believe this is the yellow Prismacolor to lay down a layer on in the eye. The eye is really warm, so starting with this yellow, and then I'll build it up from there. This is the burnt sienna Prismacolor. Doing the eye is always the most fun part. Using some of the orange Prismacolor. Back in with some of the yellow. And some of the burnt sienna Prismacolor. You remember the eye is, the eyeball itself is a sphere, and so you need to pay attention to that as you're working on it, so that you have your light side, your shadow side, all of that, all of the things that go into making something look three-dimensionally round or spherical. Some more of the yellow Prismacolor. Here I'm using the orange Prismacolor again to just mix the colors for the eye. I'm going in with the sienna brown Prismacolor. It's a lot more brown along the edge of the eye, and more golden in the middle. And here I'm using the Polychromos burnt ochre. And Polychromos white. I'm just using that to kind of desaturate a little bit of the yellow and orange there, just tone it down just a little bit. And using some white Prismacolor here. The white Prismacolor will apply a little heavier than the Polychromos, and so it will desaturate those colors a little bit more. Now using the blue-violet Prismacolor, I wanted to just add a little bit more vibrancy and richness into that black. A lot of times black on its own tends to look a little flat, so just adding in a little bit of the complementary color of the orange tones to make it pop a little better, and just putting a layer of the black Prismacolor over the top of that. And now some of the burnt sienna Prismacolor. And back to the black. Making sure to get this black area really nice and dark. This is going to be the area of the most contrast in the whole drawing. So I want to make sure that black is as dark as I can get it. Some of the burnt sienna Prismacolor. You're going to want the eye as detailed as you can get it. The eyes are always going to be the focal point in a portrait. So you draw the viewer's gaze by the amount of detail, the stronger the contrast, those kinds of things all bring in the viewer's eye. So you want to make sure that you're including those things in the eyes of your portrait subject, and so you'll do a little less detail in the areas further away from the eyes. But in the eye itself, you want to get it as detailed and as accurate as possible. Going in with a little bit of the Polychromos Magenta again. And the Polychromos Black. Just using my mono eraser here to take a little bit out of there's like a little light line there in between the corner of the eye and the eyeball. I'm working with that black Polychromos right now. Just fine-tuning all the little details and darkening up the contrast. A little bit of the Magenta Polychromos. Some of the Polychromos Walnut Brown. And back to the black. I'm using some of the Polychromos Burnt Ochre here. Just getting in all those little details. And back to the Poly Black. I'm using some of the Polychromos Blue here. There's some of the sky is reflected in the highlight, so I was just putting in a little touch of that blue. I'm just working on that contrast now. I'm very, very careful with the details. So now I'm going to start working on the section underneath the eye, and so I'm putting in a layer of the white Prismacolor as my base, and then I'll mix the colors on top of that. Using a fair amount of pressure when I put this in. I'm going in with the Magenta Polychromos. Just putting down a light layer of the color. Polychromos now. Using some of the white Polychromos in here just to mark off some of these light spots. And some of the Polychromos burnt ochre here. Warming things up as I move down the face. And here's the Prismacolor burnt sienna. Prismacolor black. Using the dark brown Prismacolor, adding in some more value as the plane, the plane of the face turns away from the light. Again, you always want to be thinking about your edges and your values. Ask yourself again and again, is it lighter than the section next to it? Is it darker than that? Is the transition between the two colors soft, hard, firm, gradual? Like always ask yourself those questions. Just building in some more detail as I see it needs it with the black pencil. A lot of times I will go back and adjust values as I continue working. I'll see that something needs to be a little darker or a little lighter to make it work correctly. Coming in and adding some texture with that black polychromos. Back in with a little bit more of that magenta polychromos. Using a little bit of that light ultramarine polychromos. Going in with some black Prismacolor. Just building up the darks there. Using the Polychromos Walnut Brown, adding in a little bit of texture. And some of the black Polychromos. And going in with some of the Prismacolor dark brown, adding in a little bit more white in there. And back in with the brown. And a little bit of black. And going back to the top of the head with some white Prismacolor, laying that base down. A little bit of light ultramarine Polychromos. So I'm taking some of the white Prismacolor now and just kind of using it to blend and lighten some of the really light areas. I'm going in now with the dark brown Prismacolor. Using a fairly light touch here, just adding in some of the hair texture. A little more of the white Prismacolor, just smoothing that out, lightening it up a little bit, softening the pencil strokes. Going in with the burnt ochre Polychromos, just adding a little bit more warmth into that spot. And some of the walnut brown Polychromos here. I'm using some of the black Polychromos now. Just adding in some texture strokes for the fur, just a little bit of variation in value. I'm just going to soften that up a little bit with my blending stump. And put down a little nice layer of white, a thick layer of the white Prismacolor. I'll be using that as my base to blend colors on top of as I move down, working through this section of the muzzle, forehead muzzle. And going in with some light ultramarine Polychromos. And just working on blending or mixing colors, and start with this layer and then move on and add the different colors in to blend them up to the color that I need. A little bit of walnut brown Polychromos there in the corner of the eye. Back to my light ultramarine. Just putting in like a really soft, light layer. Going in with some of the dark brown Prismacolor. Just really slowly and carefully building up some of the value. Just really light. It's really light here on the bridge of his nose. And so I want to use a really light touch so it doesn't get too dark on me. A little bit more of the light ultramarine polychromos. And now using some of the walnut brown polychromos. Just lightly building up some texture now. And again, being really careful not to let this get too dark on me. A little bit of black Prismacolor. And back to the walnut brown Polychromos. Just blending it out a little bit with my blending stump. Just softening the some of the lines so they're not too distinct and harsh. And back in with some of the light ultramarine polychromos. And some black polychromos now, adding some more texture in. Just little quick random strokes to make the fur texture, and keeping things really light still. I don't want anything to build up too darkly in this area. The light is hitting right on the bridge of the nose and the forehead there. So I need to use a really light touch and just enough to make it, make the pieces of hair show up, the suggestion of them show up. So now I'm going to start working on the next section. So I'm putting down a thick layer of the white Prismacolor to use as a base to blend my colors on top of. And I'm just trying to figure out what exactly is going on right here, like where each little section of the muzzle is, of the nose. I'll make certain I know what part I'm working on. It's easy to get lost, right? And so going in with a little bit of black polychromos here just to darken this spot around the eye, just kind of adjusting that value to make things really pop there. So I'm using a little bit of the walnut brown polychromos here just to put a really light layer of color down in this next section that I'm working on, going down the nose. A little bit of the light ultramarine polychromos. I'm trying really to be careful here, paying close attention to the values. They change pretty quickly in this area around the muzzle and the nose and the mouth. So you have to be fairly precise with what you're putting where. And coming in with some black polychromos. And just kind of putting in a little bit of a darker value in behind the nose as the nose is coming forward. That will help the nose stand out a little bit better. And then also along the top of the actual nose, not just the muzzle, but the nose itself, putting in some darker value there. And just mapping out those shapes and kind of carving out the bones and the structure of the skull of the dog. I find it really helpful to think of like almost in sculptural forms, like I'm sculpting the dog's face out of clay or something. When I think in those terms, when I really think about the 3 dimensions of the form that I'm drawing, it helps me picture it more realistically, and then that translates somehow into how I portray it as I'm drawing it. Just kind of a little trick in my mind to help me really think about the solidity of the forms. And here I'm just using my white Prismacolor to smooth things out, and now I'm going in with a little bit of the burnt ochre Polychromos. And some light ultramarine Polychromos. And some white Polychromos, just kind of carving out some of my lights there. And some of the black Polychromos. Adding some of the details up on the top of the nose. Just building up some of those values. A little bit of my white Prismacolor in there, softening things up. I'm going to have to give up the ghost on that pencil soon. It's getting shorter and shorter. I'm going in with the black Prismacolor now. And some of the burnt sienna Prismacolor. And some dark brown. Back in with a little bit more white. Just need to get that base layer on there. And now coming in with some of the black Prismacolor. And so I'm going a little bit darker here. I believe this is the blue Prismacolor. I'm going a little bit darker as I come down on the side of the nose there, because it's a plane shift, and so as the plane is shifting away from the light, it's going to get a little bit darker. Here I'm adding in a little bit of the true blue Prismacolor just to kind of cool off the top of the nose some. I'm just using a very, very light touch on this. And then back in with some of the dark blue, or I think it's violet blue, sorry, Prismacolor on the edge of this nose as it's about to turn away from the light. And using some of the Prismacolor black now. I'm just getting the edge of the nose in here. There's some like little darker shapes in this area. Not super dark, just a little bit darker than the surrounding area. And then going along the top of the nose with the black Prismacolor. I'm building up the value there. And back in with the violet blue Prismacolor. You know, I never like to put just the straight black down. I like to add in some other colors and help it have a little bit more life to it. I'm back with the black Prismacolor. And a little bit of my white Prismacolor. Just kind of burnishing out the side of the nose and then the black part on the top of the nose that I just put in. And some of this sienna brown. And some more white to blend everything together. And putting down a layer of white Prismacolor in the next section I'm going to work on. And a little bit of the Prismacolor True Blue. And the Polychromos Light Ultramarine. Just coming along the front of the nose here. And some of the white Polychromos. Just trying to get some of my lights back in there a little better. I'm going in with some of the Polychromos Walnut Brown. Just working on this transition here between the light part of the top of his muzzle down as it's transitioning over to the skin of the nose. It gets a little bit darker and the texture changes, so I'm just working on all of that. I'm using my black Polychromos now. And a little bit more of the violet blue Prismacolor. And some of the Polychromos Light Ultramarine, just coming down the front of the nose. And some of the Prismacolor black. I'm just going to lightly start filling in the nostrils here and just get the basic shape of them, kind of help me keep my place a little bit as I work around all of the different areas in the nose, the different values and things. This will just help me keep my place a little bit better. So I'm going to do like a rough coat of black into these nostrils. And this is about it for this section. I believe this is part 3 of this. It's slow going for sure. But I will be finishing up part 4 here before too much longer and get that posted too. And I hope you're enjoying the process, and I would love to see it if you're drawing along with me.